Hi, everyone. Welcome to the quarterly California Environmental Flows Workgroup meeting. I'm Chris Taniguchi-Kwan. I'm co-chair of this work group here with Alyssa. Alyssa, you want to say hi to everyone?
Hey everyone.
And Brianna Drescher is also a co-chair of this work group. Really excited that everyone's here today. With that, I can get started. We have a pretty short agenda today. Um, So we'll start out with new member introductions and housekeeping. We only have one presentation today, which is all about operationalizing functional flows to inform and evaluate flood managed aquifer recharge diversion approaches that I'll be giving. And then we'll end with roundtable updates from everyone, wrap up items, and talk about future agenda topics and presentations. And I do want to flag before, in case I forget, we are rescheduling or postponing our next November eFlows work group meeting because there's a conflict with the California Bioassessment Work Group, CABW, and the CalSFS meeting is also on, I think it was previously supposed to be the week before. And so it is going to change to November 17th. But we'll send out an email with a new meeting invite, new series, quarterly series meeting invite and registration. And we'll be sure to send out reminders to let everyone know of that. So with that, why don't we get started with any new member introductions? If you can kind of unmute and say your name and organization.
Hello, this is Oscar Perez. I'm with the Morongo Band of Mission and Needs. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, welcome.
Good morning. I'm Tina Calderon. I work for Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples as the Director of Ocean Protectors Program. Thank you.
Welcome, Tina.
Not exactly new, but it's Kimberly Burr, and I'm with the North Coast Stream Flow Coalition.
Hi, Kimberly.
Hi, Jeannie Neri. It's been a while since I've been able to join, but trying to get back on my calendar again. And I'm policy director and staff attorney with Russian Riverkeeper.
Awesome. Welcome, Jeannie. Welcome back.
Oh, hi everyone, I'm Kirsten. I'm a PhD student at UC Davis, and I don't know if I'm necessarily a member, but I'm joining the call today because I work with flood managed aquifer recharge. I'm happy to be here.
Welcome, Kirsten. Anyone else? And for those of you who don't want to speak, you could feel free to put your name and information in the chat too, as well. Okay, and I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. So during the presentation, if you can keep yourself muted, that would be great. We're going to have plenty of time for questions and discussion after the presentation. And hopefully we'll be able to end the meeting early today because we only have one. We were supposed to have another presentation, but we weren't able to get that one going. So, and for those of you who are new, we like to welcome a wide range of different presentations that are broadly related to environmental flows, in-stream flows, different site-specific studies. We have statewide and even more regional studies here, and just a forum to share information, talk about different approaches and some of the technical details and intricacies of in-stream flows, and also just to share different perspectives as well. So really excited to have the new people join us today, and feel free to don't be shy. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll be happy to facilitate discussion. Okay, with that, let me share my other screen. So today I'm going to be presenting on a pilot study. Let me just X out of this. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So this pilot study is all about operationalizing functional flows to inform and evaluate flood diversion approaches. Really excited about this new work that was funded by the Department of Water Resources, and this was a collaborative effort. So these are the people on my team. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of our entire team from SCORP, ESA, and the Nature Conservancy. And just a little background on this project. So we were a part of a group of different organizations that came together all on the topic of in-stream flows and how that relates to wet season managed aquifer recharge or floodmar. And a question that kept getting brought up is, well, we know about the California Environmental Flows Framework, or CEF. We've heard about functional flows, but how can we actually use functional flows to inform when water may or may not be available for diversions for recharge? And so that was kind of the motivation for this pilot study, and I'll talk a little bit more about our motivation as well.
Chris, before you get going, you wanted folks to hold their questions till the end of the presentation. Is that right?
Yeah, if you have questions as we go, feel free to put it in the chat. But I'll probably just go through the entire presentation, and then we can go back and I can answer questions as well.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. Okay, perfect. So today's goals for this presentation, I really wanted to provide an overview of our approach. We looked at a lot of different scenarios. We looked at a couple of different sites, and we also wanted to say, like, okay, what do we do? But more importantly, we wanted to synthesize our findings across the 3 case study sites that we did this analysis on. And we really see this as a starting point. Um, and then lastly, I want to highlight next steps in areas of future work. And of course, we'll have plenty of time to hear from you all. We really want to gain some feedback and answer any questions that you might have on this. And so, as many of you know, California's water systems are facing increasing pressures from climate change, competing demands, and also a lot of our ecosystems are in decline. At the same time, floodmar, managed aquifer recharge, and other wet season diversion efforts are creating new opportunities to leverage times of high flows, times of potential excess flows, and potentially offset or reduce pressure during the dry season. And so, as these efforts are continuing to expand statewide, an important question that we have is, how can we better understand and account for the ecological functions that are supported by these important winter flows? And that's kind of the motivation for this study. For those of you who are less familiar with floodmar specifically, it's a strategy that essentially diverts floodwater or wet season flows for the purpose of groundwater recharge, rather than only relying on dry season diversions when flows and ecological conditions are typically stressed. And so it's one of the main reasons, or one of the main ways, that California is advancing conjunctive management, which the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, has made an urgent and ongoing priority statewide. And so, done well, floodmar can really provide multiple benefits all at once, both to water users, both to critically overdrafted basins, and then also to ecosystems. But actually realizing those ecosystem benefits means that we need to treat floodwaters not just as surplus water, but as these functional ecological processes that we need to account for. And we know that floods and wet season flows provide important ecological benefits. So the amount of water in river matters, but also the timing, the magnitude, the frequency, and the variability of flows over time. So not just one snapshot in time. And floods aren't just excess water. They're functional ecological processes that support a wide range of things like habitat connectivity, sediment transport, riparian recruitment, and they also provide important life cycle cues for aquatic and riparian species. And so what you see here is a natural flow regime, a hydrograph of stream flow over time, where you see natural patterns of low flows. See these smaller high flows, and we have these natural flooding events. And what you see on the right is that many alterations, including things like dams, can reduce this natural variability and make flows look really uniform, as you see on the hydrograph on the right, really reducing the natural variability over time. And all of this like uniform flatlining of flows can really impact ecological processes that depend on these natural flow patterns. And not only are floods important, but multiple components of the annual hydrograph support different ecological functions and processes throughout the year. For example, we have different flow events that can support fish migration and spawning, floodplain connectivity, rearing habitat, riparian recruitment, and important geomorphic processes like sediment transport and channel maintenance processes. So the key idea is that the flow timing, the magnitude, the duration, and variability all matter ecologically, and not just that total annual flow, the total amount of flow in a river. And so a key concept that's underlying a functional flows approach is that all different aspects of the annual hydrograph work together to support broad ecosystem functions. So as Floodmore and these other wet season diversion efforts expand, there is an increasing need to better understand and incorporate these ecological functions supported by winter flows, or these functional flows. And so this really creates an opportunity to proactively integrate the ecosystem considerations into Floodmore implementation from the onset. And so it's a really exciting time, and I'm really excited to be looking into this specific aspect of work. And so we envision two primary pathways that functional flows can potentially support Floodmore and wet season diversion efforts. The first one is to really inform diversion approaches. So it can help identify when and where water might be available for diversions, for recharge. And so we can incorporate these ecological functional flows into our wet season diversion approaches. We can use them as kind of thresholds to inform when water might be high enough to be able to divert. The second piece is kind of on the back end, so evaluating existing diversion approaches that you might be contemplating. And so you might be looking at using a wide range of methods to inform your diversion approaches. We can actually use functional flows to assess how different approaches, like the 90-20, for example, might support or alter our functional flow metrics. And then the last piece is ultimately might be interested in exploring trade-offs between diversion opportunities and functional flow support across different systems. And so we can kind of calculate different diversion metrics and different functional flow metrics and look at the responses across a wide range of sites. And so for this particular pilot study, our main objectives were to first develop or refine a functional flow-informed workflow for wet season diversions. And this is really building off of the work that TNC and others have started on a blog post on how do we actually take those flow metrics to inform when water might be available for diversions. The second piece is to explore approaches to assess stream flow alteration from diversion scenarios. So how do we actually look at flow remaining in the river after you divert water out across these different scenarios and assess if flows are being altered or changed? And then the last piece is that trade-off piece, is bringing in our stream flow alteration, but also thinking about it from the recharge perspective for water available for recharge. And so how do we strike that balance and look at both of those aspects that we're trying to consider? And so for this case study, we are looking at 3 different sites, the Scott River, Stony Creek, and Elder Creek in the Sac Valley. Each of these 3 sites have long-term historical stream flow records, at least 30 years of gauge data that we can start from. And ultimately, we're going to run our functional flow scenario. So we developed our functional flow informed diversion workflow. So how do we actually take those metrics and understand how much water we should subtract out? And then at each of our gauges, we can apply our diversion scenarios, which are function flows approach. We're looking at existing approaches like 90-20, and I'm going to show you all the wide range of different approaches we're looking at. So essentially, we have our observed flow in the river. We can subtract out water available from our different diversion approaches, and then we know how much water is remaining in the river. And with that information, we can ultimately quantify diversion opportunities. So I'll kind of highlight what I mean by diversion opportunities, different metrics. We can also assess functional flow alteration. So we know the water remaining in the river. We can calculate functional flow metrics from that daily flow time series. And then we can see how are these functional flow metrics changing compared to observed flow, compared to what we would expect under unimpaired conditions. And then the last piece, again, is looking at the trade-offs. We're bringing those two pieces together. So I'm going to kind of step you through each of these different elements and present our findings from these 3 sites. And so this is the suite of diversion scenarios, diversion approaches that we're looking at. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all of them, but I'll talk about a little bit about each. So the 90-20 is the State Water Board streamlined permitting method. It's really based on daily flow percentile. So flow needs to exceed the 90th percentile across the period of record for any given day. And there's also a 20% maximum amount of diversion that can happen based on daily stream flow. We have also developed 3 functional flow informed scenarios where we're looking at we're using different flow thresholds as our lower limit. And so we have 2 based on the wet season median flow. We have kind of a more higher protective threshold at the 2-year peak flow. And then we also want to preserve key flood events when they happen, the 2, 5, and 10-year events. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the functional flow scenarios today. And then we also have an eco-hydraulic scenario that uses a site-specific study by ESA that looks at different salmonid life stages and gives us kind of a single lower limit flow threshold. And then we recently added a new cumulative wet season diversion approach that we're calling 80-50 just for this presentation for short. That's based on cumulative flow for any given day, and does the flow exceed that 80th percentile of cumulative flow? And it also stops diversion when cumulative flow is below the 50th percentile. For all of these diversion approaches, we have a 20% cap on daily diversion, so you can't divert more than 20% of daily flow for any given day. And then we also consider downstream water rights and delta conditions if they're applicable at the sites that we're looking at. And so I just wanted to caveat that for all of our diversion scenarios, we're looking at that. And so jumping into a little bit more specifics on our functional flow informed approach, as I mentioned, we looked at 3 different diversion thresholds. And so essentially water in the river, flow in the river needs to exceed either the wet season median flow at the 50th or 70th percentile. This is taken from the natural flows database. So this is an unimpaired estimate. Or water needs to exceed the 2-year peak flow threshold. So this is a higher value in order for diversions to be allowed. And then, as I mentioned, for any given year, we want to try to preserve key flood events that are providing ecological functions. So the 2-year, the 5-year, and the 10-year flood events. So the first flood event that occurs, we're going to make sure that that is preserved and that passes. Anything above that can be diverted out. And then again, we have a 20% daily diversion cap. And so the idea here is that we're using our unimpaired flow predictions from the natural flows database to serve as kind of our starting point to say, okay, we want to ensure that these functional flow metrics are protected for any given year in our diversion scenarios. And just, I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to hone in on this, that why these wet season functional flows components matter ecologically. So wet season base flows really support connectivity, fish passage, aquatic habitat for salmonids. Our peak magnitude flows really drive important geomorphic processes, floodplain connection, and it reduces exotic species encroachment from within the channel. And it's also important noting, so for this particular study, we're looking at alteration of the wet season base flow and peak flows. But it's worth noting that wet season diversions can also have an effect on the spring recession and on dry season flows. But for this particular assessment, we're really focusing on the wet season base flow and peak flows because of limitations of how we're simulating these diversion scenarios. So we're using historical gauge data and subtracting out water that's available, but we can't really adequately capture the effects of diversions on later season flow components. We would need a more site-specific watershed model to do that. And so we're really trying to be intentional on what we can and we cannot say with confidence. So just want to caveat that. And so this is an actual hydrograph from Scott River for water year 2015. So this is a moderate water year. The gray line shows what's actually in the river with no diversions, so from the gauge. The gray band shows kind of our floodmar wet season diversion period. So we're only diverting out during this wet season period. And the horizontal lines show our functional flow thresholds from the natural flows database for those base flow, the bottom two, the wet season 75 and 50th percentile, and the upper limits of our peak flows that we're trying to preserve, the 2-year, the 5-year, and the 10-year event. And so here, what you see, this dashed line, is the functional flow wet season 50 scenario. So that's water in the river after we divert it out from our rule set. And water essentially needs to be above the wet season 50th percentile, this red line, in order for diversions to start. And if it goes below that, we don't allow diversions at all. And so the gray line, this vertical line, that difference between the observed flow and our scenario is the water that's available for recharge in our scenario. And so you can see we have that 20% cap that really limits the total water from flatlining the system all the way down to the red line. And so you can see it's really only at the peaks where water is available in this specific water year. And I do want to note that this is one water year where we only have a 10-year flood event. So you can see here. And so in this case, we want to make sure that this 10-year flood is met. Anything above that is available for diversion. And so if we had 3 scenarios, if we look at our upper scenario, this is using our 2-year peak flow event as our lower limit. And so water essentially needs to be above this line in order for diversions to occur. So you can see here the pink line, it's really only the peak of this 10-year event where water is available because flow never drops, or flow is below that 2-year threshold. So really not a lot of opportunity using this peak year 2 event for recharge compared to the last scenario I showed you. So this is just to give you an idea of kind of how our workflow works and some of the rule sets that go within this scenario. We also looked at an ecohydraulic scenario where we used a flow threshold of 362 CFS based on a site-specific study that was done on Scott River by ESA, and this was really focused on salmonid life stages. And so we have kind of our lower limit, which is this site-specific base flow threshold, and then we also looked at a 20% cap on daily diversions. And so before getting into the results, I mentioned we look at a suite of recharge metrics to characterize recharge opportunity. We looked at this across 3 dimensions. so the magnitude, so how much water is being diverted, the frequency, so how often is water being diverted, and the duration, so how long is each diversion event lasting when you are allowed to divert. And so we have a suite of metrics. I'm not showing all of them. These are just a couple of metrics to give you a flavor. So if you have more questions about that, happy to share our table with everyone. And so I wanted to share some of our um, things, our results across the different sites. So starting with magnitude, our functional flow peak 2 consistently provided the least amount of water available for recharge. The functional flow wet season 50th provided the most. Again, we have the peak is a higher limit and the wet season 50 is a lower limit. But that gradient held true across almost all of the sites, at all of the sites. At Scott specifically, the eco-hydraulic actually tops all of them. So it has the lowest limit, so it provided the most amount, total volume of water available for recharge. For frequency, it tells a little bit different story. So 80/50 and the functional flow peak 2 are both the least frequent. So meaning that there's fewer years, fewer days with any diversion opportunity at all. And then the wet season 50th, it provides the most frequent, so the most years where diversion is allowed. And then for duration, it really flips the ranking. So the functional flow peak 2 provides the shortest duration. 80/50 actually provides the longest duration. So once that diversion is actually triggered, it tends to run for a while. And 80/50 is a little bit interesting because it's not just a simple high-low across the different metrics. It's really distinct, but it tends to be pretty infrequent. It doesn't really happen on the driest years. It happens on wetter years. But when it does turn on, it lasts for a pretty long time and you get pretty high volumes when it does turn on. And there were a couple of site-specific notes. So Elder Creek shows much more overlap between approaches than the other two sites. We're thinking that it's because it has a flashier rain-driven hydrology. And so the scenarios don't necessarily separate out as clearly, so they all look pretty similar. Scott has the longest duration of any site. It's relatively unregulated. It has late season snowmelt that may extend availability. And Stony has the most instances of zero diversion of any site. And it's one of the three sites with major flow regulation upstream, which likely plays a role in that. But we need to kind of dig a little bit further on the mechanism for all of this. And so just summarizing what we found kind of across the three sites and across the different scenarios and recharge metrics, 90/20, the functional flow peak 2 and the two wet season functional flow scenarios are pretty much what we would expect from the patterns that I mentioned earlier, what we just saw. The functional flow peak 2 is pretty low across the board by design. The wet season 50th provides the most opportunity, and the wet season 75 is kind of a happy medium in between. 80/50 is the one that's kind of worth pausing on because it doesn't fit that simple high-low label across the metrics. It tends to be low frequency, so not a lot of years where you get diversion, but when it does happen, you get a long duration and you get kind of an intermediate magnitude or volume of water that can actually be quite high when diversions actually do occur in the wettest years. So it's a fundamentally different profile from the functional flow scenario, but not necessarily more or less recharge opportunity. It really depends on when and how that opportunity shows up. And we also wanted to look at what does this look like in terms of in-stream flow in the river after you divert out the water across the different scenarios. So this figure shows the Scott River for water year 1983. So this was a wet year. And it compares how each diversion scenario plays out on an actual hydrograph. So again, that gray line is observed flow with no diversion. The colored dashed lines are what remains in the river under each scenario after you divert it out. And then the colored boxes are the 1,000 acre feet of total water for each year that was available for diversion for each scenario. And so what I wanted to highlight from all of this is this box, which is the peaks of the two largest events, plus several smaller ones that followed. For the functional flow, both functional flow scenarios, the wet season 75 on the top right, the peak 2 on the bottom, so both right panels, they explicitly protect the main peak 2 and 5 year events when they occur, holding flow at or above those thresholds. So you can see for these two 5 year events, the flows are preserved, and the 2 year flood events as well. In contrast, for 90/20 and 80/50, they divert flow down below those thresholds because neither of those were specifically designed to preserve those flood events. Now, if you look at the inner storm period between the peak flow events around February and March, this new boxed area, this is where we start to see a real distinction show up. So the functional flow peak 2 actually stays conservative the whole time. And so you can see the pink line matches this gray line here, no diversion at all. The functional flow at season 75 actually allows for diversion on nearly every day within this window at volumes that are very comparable to the 80/50 scenario. And so the real distinction between the functional flow wet season 75 and 80/50 isn't the total volume, because it's pretty comparable, 90 and 80,000 acre feet, but it's specifically on the peak flow events, preserving those peak magnitude flows when they occur in the year. Now, let's look at a dry year example. So this is at Scott River, water year 2014. You notice right away there isn't any 2 year, 5 year, 10 year flood events that are happening at all this year. And so you can see that off the bat. 80/50, so panel C, and the functional flow peak 2 showed no diversion at all under this dry year. And so for 80/50, that cumulative flow never actually passes the 80th percentile trigger. And then for the functional flow peak 2, flow is never above the 2 year flood. And so you don't get any diversion. And so there's really no recharge opportunity at all this year. And then 90/20, you do see some diversion, 2.2, compared coming off of the two visible peaks, the box that are marked here. But for the wet season 75, we actually get some diversion across a smaller peak event. So you get a little bit more recharge opportunity for the functional flow wet season 75. So the key takeaway is that in dry years, 80/50 and the functional flow peak 2 typically don't provide a lot of recharge opportunity at all, while the wet season threshold rules like the wet season 75 and 90/20 do provide some opportunities for recharge. And so the pattern that we saw at Scott, that functional flow wet season 50 and 75 diverting the most in the wet years, that functional flow peak 2 diverted the least. That held true across all the sites. 80/50 also diverts heavily in wet years at Scott and Elder. But Stony Creek kind of breaks this pattern. At Stony, for the wet year, 80/50 is barely ahead of 90/20, and actually well below the functional flow scenarios. And in dry years, 80/50 drops to 0 at Scott and Elder, while the functional flow scenarios actually allow diversions to occur at a modest pace. And one of the key questions, so that was all for the recharge metrics. A key question for all of this work was, how do we actually detect meaningful ecological change from these different diversion scenarios? And so we looked at multiple lines of evidence for this. For the first one, we looked at a CEF, so the California Environmental Flows Framework alteration classification. So these are guidelines on how to assess alteration for each of the functional flow metrics. And it essentially classifies each metric into a different category. Likely altered, so most of the values fall within the natural range. Likely unaltered is that most of the values within a scenario falls outside of that range. It could be above, it could be below, or indeterminate, where you get kind of a mix of both and it's hard to classify. But it's really a useful benchmark, but it's essentially a categorical answer for each metric. And what I'll show next is it doesn't actually distinguish among the scenarios that we're looking at any of our sites. And so we also needed something more continuous. And so we looked at ideally deviation from unimpaired. So the change in these functional flow metrics compared to what we'd expect under natural conditions. That would be ideal, but it really requires daily unimpaired flow data so we can calculate annual functional flow metrics to get that comparison, that deviation or subtraction between observed flows or flows after we divert compared to unimpaired. But unfortunately, we didn't have that information at any of the sites, and so our available alternative was to take a water year type matched median. So from the natural flows database, we can say under a wet year, what is the median prediction? And then we can make that approximation. But this adds a little bit of approximation error, and it's really hard to interpret that data because it's not like from 2010, what is the direct comparison. It's kind of a broad scale comparison. So what we ended up using was deviation from baseline or the observed flow. So how do these functional flow metrics change compared to what's in the river currently? And so this allowed us to get a true year-to-year comparison, and it really allowed us to isolate each scenario's own effect directly. The trade-off is it doesn't actually tell us how close any scenario is to unimpaired conditions, but it just gives us a measure of how each scenario shifts flow relative to what's already there in the river. And one more thing worth flagging is that none of the three approaches that I mentioned directly capture whether a scenario compresses the natural range of variability, even when the typical or the median value for that flow metric might barely move. And so median conditions might be okay. And so if you look at the figure to the right, this is just a general illustration. So even if a diversion scenario's median, the blue one on the right, matches the unimpaired median exactly, the spread of values around it or the size of the box plot doesn't necessarily have to match. So in this case, this flow metric would be classified as likely unaltered. It falls within the range. But you can see that the box plot is actually getting narrower and smaller and essentially narrowing the box. So there's less natural variability, and this could matter ecologically. And so essentially a scenario can pass the Ceph classification as unaltered, and show a small deviation from baseline, but it still could be squeezing or compressing that natural spread of outcomes down towards a single value or a narrower band. And that's exactly the kind of change this range compression change is built to capture. And so we assess kind of changes in that natural variability using this assessment. And so let's start with the Ceph alteration classification itself. So across all three sites, there are no diversion scenarios that we tested that ever shifted a metric into a different alteration category compared to baseline conditions. So at Scott River and Elder Creek, everything from the wet season base flow and peak flow metrics, they stayed classified as likely unaltered no matter which diversion scenario we applied. At Stony Creek, it was a little different. The wet season base flow magnitude was classified as likely altered, even under current baseline conditions before any diversion scenarios were applied. And that's consistent with pre-existing flow modification from the dam upstream, and not necessarily something that's coming from our diversion scenarios. So the real finding here isn't that everything is fine everywhere, everything stayed in the same class. It's really that this classification assessment couldn't discriminate among our scenarios at any site, whether it shared results, whether it started out from being unimpaired like at Scott and Elder, or whether the flow metric was already altered to begin with, like at Stony. And so that's one of the limitations of using this classification alone. to compare across diversion approaches. And that's exactly why we went forward with looking at a more continuous measure of alteration. But before we kind of dive into the results, one of the key things that we're looking at was looking at not just a single year change, but looking at change across the full period of record, so that range compression. So for the peak 2-year duration and frequency, the pattern is pretty consistent everywhere. 90-20 and 80-50 compress these more than baseline and the natural range, while the functional flow scenarios track baseline more closely. And so they're essentially preserving the peak magnitudes and also the duration and frequency. At Elder Creek, we actually have a response curve, a trade-off curve that for this that I'll show in a little bit, but it actually shows the same thing that's holding true across the wide range of diversion volumes that we simulated across the period of records, not just 1 year. The wet season base flow is a little bit more site specific. So at Elder, the functional flow wet season 50 scenario compresses variability more than any other scenario, including baseline, because the threshold, our lower limit threshold, is at that median value. At Scott, the functional flow scenarios did compress variability the most, while eco-hydraulic does something a little bit different. It actually shifted the median down, but it didn't compress the variability. So you see the base flows tended to be lower altogether, but it wasn't changing that range or that spread of base flow values. And at Stony, none of the scenarios really stood out from one another for the wet season base flow. They all looked pretty same across all the scenarios that we looked at. And we're thinking that the flashy hydrology really limits how much water any diversion scenario can actually divert, because the flows drop down really quickly and no diversions are allowed for a lot of time. So for range compression and everything else that we've just walked through, it points to a bigger question. So how do we actually characterize trade-off between recharge opportunity and stream flow alteration? And that's pretty complicated because there's multiple different recharge metrics. We have multiple different functional flow metrics that we're trying to compare. And so how do we actually prioritize which trade-off curves we want to look at, because there's dozens of different combinations that we can develop trade-off curves. And not all of these curves are going to show a real usable relationship. And so what we did was we needed to prioritize which flow metric and which recharge metric combinations were actually worth developing into response curves. And so we looked at a two-step process. The first one was we wanted to ensure that the metrics were highly correlated. So we did a Spearman correlation between each annual recharge metric, each deviation from baseline for our functional flow metrics. And we wanted to look for something that was consistent across all scenarios, not just driven by one scenario or a couple. The second piece, so once we did that correlation screen, those that passed, we visually inspected the response curves between all of those correlated metrics that passed. Some combinations looked fine statistically in terms of correlation, but they were really messy. It looked like a spaghetti soup, or all the lines were kind of together. And that doesn't really tell you much from a management perspective. And that's not something that you would use for a decision support tool. And so we went through this kind of two-step screening process at all of the sites to develop our final response curves, a subset of curves at each site. And this is just to give you an idea of the correlation screen, what it actually looks like at Scott River. So on the rows, we have our functional flow metric values for peaks and for the wet season. And then on the columns, we have our annual diversion or recharge metrics that we calculated. And so the colored boxes represent the correlation, red being positive correlation, blue being negative, and then the darkness of the dots represent the strength of that correlation. So in this example, The dark blue boxes had the highest correlation. Things like the annual total diversion volume each year and the wet season base flow magnitude values. And so these dark blue boxes were the ones that we moved forward in developing response curves. And so this is just a summary of the response curve combinations that we developed for each of the sites. I'm not going to go into each of them, but I'm going to show you a couple of examples from the Scott River that showed the widest range of diversion volumes and also showed the clearest separation between the scenarios to really illustrate some trade-offs that you can visualize. And so the first curve that you see here is for the Scott River. It's for the wet season base flow magnitude at the 10th percentile. And it's paired with the annual diversion volume. And so that's what you see on the X. This is our total amount of water diverted by each year. So each point is a different water year in our scenario. And then the y-axis is the deviation from baseline. So the change in this wet season base flow from our observed flow in the river. So 0% means that this flow metric really didn't change much compared to what we see at the gauge. And then the further you get away from the curve, the less and less flow you have compared to what was in the river without any diversion. And so you can see here the colored lines represent each of the different diversion scenarios that we looked at. And you can see there's two scenarios, the 90-20 and this pink, which is our functional flow peak 2, our most protective functional flow scenario. Those, they really minimize any change in wet season base flow. It's very close to the gauge data, but they also provide the least amount of recharge opportunity. So you can see it does not extend this full range of diversion volume. The one that was kind of our happy medium in this case was the functional flow wet season 75. This is this purple line where you can see it minimizes alteration. It minimizes change from the gauge for the wet season base flow. And it also spans a wide range of diversion volume across our period of record. And then you can see the sorting of these curves can tell you kind of a little bit about how well they're doing in terms of minimizing alteration. And also the width of the curve tells you how much recharge opportunity you're getting. And so the 80-50 is interesting. So this one tracks pretty closely where it minimizes alteration up until a certain volume of water. And at least at Scott, after 50,000 acre feet, you see this sharp decline and a sharp reduction in the wet season base flow after that volume. So it's not only kind of the sorting of the curves and the width of the curves, but it's also the shape of the curves and kind of an inflection point of when you start to see a big steep drop, a big change in the flow metric. And then the eco-hydraulic is another scenario where even for a small amount of diversion, you start to see a lot of change in the wet season base flow at even low amounts of diversion going on. And so, again, this is an illustration of what we produced, and it could really serve as a starting point, a conversation point when deciding on which diversion metrics or diversion approaches you want to look at, or even if you're looking at a particular permit application, you might say, hey, I have pump restrictions where I know I can't even divert up to 50, so maybe this might be a good option. So again, a good conversation starter to from a management perspective. This is a different curve, so we're still looking at the wet season base flow. This is the wet season median flow, the 50th percentile, paired with a different recharge metric. So this time we're looking at total diversion days instead of volume. So the total number of days each year where diversion is allowed on the x-axis. So this is a little different. So it's the same story where the 90-20 and the functional flow peak 2 are very close to baseline. They minimize alteration, but they also provide limited number of days where you can get diversion going on. But in terms of the other ranking, you start to see things flip. So in terms of the total diversion days, 80-50, that gold line, actually shows the smallest deviation and it's not the wet season 75 like in the last example. So this wet season 75 actually starts out with small deviation, and then it drops out. You can see here this purple one where you get a steep decline. And so take home message from kind of what we're seeing with these two curves is it's really not which scenario is best. It really depends on what metric you're looking at, what flow metric, but also what recharge metric you're looking at. Is it the volume, or is it more on the duration, the number of days where you get diversion? And whichever you prioritize from a management perspective could change which approach comes out ahead. And so that's kind of the core of a trade-off analysis, right? It's a give and take. And so we tended to see a similar pattern from Scott, at least with the first trade-off curve at Alder Creek and Stony Creek, with that smaller overall deviation with the functional flow peak 2 and 90/20, but then also the most limited diversion opportunity, limited diversion range. The functional flow at season 75 consistently shows smaller deviation from some of the lower threshold scenarios. But one so in general, these are typically what we found across the 3 sites. This is a different response curve that I mentioned earlier for Elder Creek. So this is looking at the peak 2-year duration, so the number of days where you get that peak flow event each year, and it's compared to the total annual diversion volume. And it kind of confirms what we were seeing earlier with the range compression, that the peak preservation is more preserved during our functional flow scenarios. But now you can see that the 90/20 shows the steepest decline, that red line, as the diversion volume increases, at least when you're looking at the peak duration, and 80/50 is pretty similar. And all of our functional flow scenarios decline more gradually. And we also get a wider range of diversion opportunity with the functional flows 75 and 50 as well. So really, it really depends on the site that you're looking at. It depends on the metrics that you're looking at. But these trade-off curves could be really useful in looking at and visualizing trade-offs between recharge and functional flow alteration. And so the bottom line here is that there's no single approach that's universally optimal. The functional flow, for example, wet season 75 and 80/50, those each present different trade-offs, and there isn't one that's strictly better than the other. The functional flow wet season 75 tends to extend the recharge opportunity. It shows smaller deviation from baseline as well, and it preserves those peak flow events. Separately, all of our functional flow scenarios really build on that peak flow preservation for the 2, 5, and 10-year events. And that's something that's specifically different and that's lacking from some of the other scenarios like 80/50, for example. 80/50 is really good at sustaining diversions more continuously throughout the wetter years. So it might be suitable if you prioritize consistent, predictable operations over minimizing kind of deviation over a single stress test event. And which metric combination really matters depending on the site, depending on your questions asked. And so we saw that directly with Scott, where it actually flipped the ranking of the approach depending on what you're optimizing. Is it total volume or is it total diversion days? But before I get into kind of more specifics of each approach, what we're seeing is that this is a really good starting point to build from. There's no single diversion criterion that is a silver bullet, but it really depends on what a practitioner is actually trying to accomplish on the ground and what they have to work with. So 2 things that really drive that thinking is the project's objective and the infrastructure available. So on objectives, let's take 2 different types of goals. So if your objective is for groundwater basin recovery for significant overdraft, that might favor approaches that maximize volume and duration. You might want as much water as you can, as often as you can. If floodplain restoration is your priority, that's a different story. There, you might want an approach like the functional flow peak 2 that only diverts in the wettest years, and you have smaller and moderate events that are preserved for inundation rather than capturing for the full recharge opportunity. And then the same toolbox, different objective, different answer. So it really depends. And then on infrastructure, rented pumps might favor fewer, longer diversion windows because renting them for a whole season is really expensive. While if you have more of a permanent, remotely controlled infrastructure, you might be able to handle those short, scattered diversion windows without extra operational burden. So these site-specific things could matter a lot depending on what's your priority. So walking through what we're finding across the 3 sites, 90/20 tends to be good when you need fast permitting, you have flexible infrastructure, but we tended to see frequent, short, and scattered diversion windows, which is consistent across other studies. 80/50 tends to work well if you're trying to minimize rented pump time or targeting basin recovery volumes, but there's a real chance of getting nothing in dry years, which could also be an ecological benefit. But all of these approaches need some level of flow monitoring. So 90/20, you do need to know where today's flow sits relative to a percentile, so the 90th percentile. 80/50, you also need to know a running cumulative tally of cumulative flow for every day in the water year. And so you do need to keep track of like on the ground flow conditions to inform when water may be available for recharge. The functional flow approaches also need kind of a close day-to-day tracking since we're trying to protect those peak flow events and the base flows. This doesn't necessarily require a true forecasting model because you can look at maybe the prior day or the previous couple of days and look at that lag to see if, okay, do we think flows are within the 2-year flood? Can we divert out? And then the functional flow peak 2 really fits best where floodplain inundation itself is the management priority, but it's not necessarily the approach for groundwater basin recovery because it really minimizes recharge opportunity. And then the eco-hydraulic scenario is built around site-specific studies at Scott. So it was like a single threshold tied to base flow conditions for salmonids. The trade-off with that is it's really tuned to preserve one aspect specifically, the base flow, doesn't necessarily capture the full set of functional flow components in the way that our functional flow-based approaches are. And so it's also worth noting that we only looked at one site that had an eco-hydraulic scenario. One general caveat across all of this is that these like practical considerations come from 3 sites that we evaluate. And so I think in broad strokes, the things that I was talking about, objectives, infrastructure, monitoring, they generalize reasonably well across sites, but the specific trade-offs that we're seeing, how one rule might trigger more operational complexity or how it could look different. It could essentially look different at a site with different hydrology, different infrastructure, different regulatory contexts. And so we're seeing this as kind of general guidance as a starting point, but not really a fixed rule that's going to apply everywhere to every single site. We really need additional sites, different additional context management concerns to really test this out. And so beyond this contract, it was really exciting that we kind of built this foundation, but we also highlighted a lot of opportunity for follow-up work. The first one is identifying additional pilot sites, ideally ones where we can get modeled daily unimpaired flow, not just kind of our baseline gauge data. since that's a real limitation of this current analysis. So it'd be great to have that information. Even better if a site sits in a Sigma basin where recharge projects have already happened or they're currently being discussed. That would give us a real world implementation context. And then second, reworking the trade-off curves to really measure deviation from unimpaired directly rather than from baseline current conditions that we used here. And then we can use those curves to identify actual inflection points, those steep changes in slope where we see a drop off in those curves. If we had unimpaired data and that deviation from unimpaired, it could give us a little more insight on when a little bit more diversion starts to carry more meaningfully ecological risk. And also it'll allow us to be able to communicate that ecological risk more directly compared to kind of the status quo. And then the third, we'd like to bring in forecasting, incorporating water year percentile forecast into our diversion thresholds themselves, really building from Sarah Yarnell and others' work on dam operations. And so implementation of the functional flows approach can be more forward-looking because in this we use historical gauge data to do the analysis. And essentially, if we have the more forward-looking forecast, we can adjust our flowmetric values based on predicted conditions for that given year, rather than looking at historical flow after the fact, like what we did. And then finally, we're starting the conversation with the Department of Water Resources and hopefully other agencies and you all here about identifying real partners for a pilot implementation. So if you know of a site, a data set, a project, or you're from an agency or organization that is really interested in advancing this work and working on an actual permit application, for example, we'd love to connect with you all to see how we can potentially collaborate and see how we can work together to advance this work. And so I think we developed a really good starting point, and there's a lot of opportunities for next steps. And finally, to close, this is a summary of what this project produced. So first, we developed and refined a functional flow informed alternative diversion approach. So an additional tool within this toolbox of diversion approaches that someone could use. And we didn't just develop it for the 3 sites. We developed a replicable method, a code base that could be applied wherever there's interest in wet season diversion for recharge. And we also have a technical report that kind of lays out the thought process and what the code is actually doing for those of you who are interested. And then the second one is a methodology for assessing functional flow alteration under different diversion scenarios. So that includes the CEF classification, like likely altered, unaltered in that classification, plus the deviation from baseline screening that we walked through today. And then the third piece is a framework for actually evaluating the trade-offs between recharge opportunity and streamflow alteration and those response curves and that toolbox framing that came from all of this. And so I think we've built a good foundation, and hopefully this is just the start of future conversations and future work with you all on where this could go next. So with that, I'll pause for any questions or comments. And I will say that this presentation, this meeting is being recorded, so we'll post all of this online if you want to share that. And also the PowerPoint and meeting materials will be posted on the EFOS Workgroup meeting site as well. Yeah, Christian. Oh, I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear him, or is it just?
No, I can't hear him either.
Can't hear you, Christian.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I had to reload the Zoom app today and it lost all my defaults. I was wondering how the in rivers where the channel morphology has been altered, and so you lose that linkage um, between flow and optimal habitat. How you use this approach in a river where the functional flows themselves may not provide that same benefit that they did
Really?
before.
Yeah. Um, so I presented a lot today.
Yeah.
And I had to cut out a lot of the specifics of the functional flow approaches for that reason. But that's a really good question. So I presented this pilot approach where we took the functional flow metrics, the unimpaired flows from the natural flows database as is. But as Christian alluded to, there may be sites where that unimpaired flow isn't actually providing the ecological benefit that it was intended to, because let's say the channel is incised and now you can't get the overbank flows that you want for that lateral connectivity, for example. In those cases where you have the site specific data on either the channel morphology or even a site specific study where you've actually modeled um, a flow ecology model, or you've done a hydraulic model, you have a study, you have an adjusted range of flows that may be higher than what or lower than what you would need under natural conditions, you would use that. So you would essentially go through the same process for Ceph to get your refined set of functional flow metrics based on your current conditions, and then use that to inform when diversion should turn on and off. In most places that we're thinking about and are looking at the state, we don't have that information. And so you could use the natural flows database as a starting point. And then another aspect of that I didn't talk about for the peaks in particular is infrastructure and flood constraints. So we've
Oh
had
yeah.
like different studies that Sarah has done, for example, where you don't want to flood out a whole town, and you know what the channel capacity is and what flow is associated with that, um, the flooding. And so you would also want to reduce down your flood. So you want to ensure that floods don't go out of the channel, or you can actually minimize it. So you can actually divert out to lower your flood risk. Um, so I think those pieces are really important, and especially like the flooding, or if you know that your channel is incised and you want to get the important lateral connectivity, you can use like a channel cross-sectional survey and a simple method to figure out what flow you would need to inundate. Um, but really good question.
Great. Thanks. Great answer. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, I don't know who is next. Uh, Norman.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
You hit the nail on the head when you said you presented a lot. That was a lot, and I can really appreciate the deep thought that's gone into these evaluations. These are very, very difficult, and I'm going to raise a couple other things that would make it even more difficult, but I think that would have to be done when you if you're moving from more or less like I think what you've done you could characterize as like raw water availability, like in the without regard to some of the things you did touch on at the end, like how big of a pump is reasonable to have here and there. In other words, what's the maximum rate you would take and so on until you exceed the ability of the local aquifer to take that recharge. So there's a ton of other things that would have to go into it. So that's why I think like I would characterize this as like raw availability, and that's a good first step. Um, One thing that I was really keying on is that, and I've seen this in some other places where we had to put some of these conditions in a permit. It's like when you're in this work, you're approaching this like with a perfect knowledge kind of um luxury, because you have like you're looking at actual stream flows that occurred. But if you were operationalizing this, you don't know if that water, when it starts rising, is it going to hit that 2-year peak threshold that you're trying to protect. So those brings up lots of other complexities, and you did touch on that at the end. Credit good due, where you talked about how you might have to do some kind of prediction. But I did want to ask you there if let's say that take the 10-year event that you want to protect. If
Mhm.
that event has already occurred a couple times in a given year, or maybe it occurred just last year, does that make it fair game for diversion, or and maybe in your scenario, no, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, good question. So for the 10-year flood example, we really only preserve the first event where that occurs in that year. So if there's two 10-year floods, we would make sure the full 10-year flood up until the magnitude is preserved.
Right.
Um, and then you can shave off anything above that in the peak. And then the next one that occurs, you can divert down to the 20% cap.
I see.
So if you look close at the hydrograph, it's like the first one meets that line and the other ones are a little bit below it.
Right.
And that's because the 20% cap actually also helps with that. And so we did the same for all the 2, 5, and 10. We just ensured that the first one was preserved. There still was diversion prior to that on the rising limb up in
Yeah.
20% cap. But it's essentially like that peak event is
Right. Right.
predicted. And yeah, the perfect foresight, this was using historical gauge data, so we already knew how many peak events happened and what they were.
Right.
In reality, if you're at a site and you have a gauge, I think you can look at the previous day and the current day and get an idea of like, okay, did I reach the 2-year flood? Am I still yesterday and is it above or below that? And so I think you can use that as a metric.
Right.
So you can kind of go back and see where you are and where you were and where you are. But that's why I brought up the work that Sarah's been working on, which is more on how do you take forecasts each year and use that
Yeah.
to project out. And then you'll get a better idea of like the frequency and what types of floods you might get in a given water year. So I think that would be a cool next step to operationalize in this context.
One last point that I wanted to bring up, and some colleagues of mine at DWR wanted to make sure I put this in if it didn't come up, is that well, and I don't know how much of this has been addressed in some of the work that DWR has done on San Joaquin tributaries, but once this water gets recharged, then it will, some of it could be pumped out, but eventually some of it's going to probably make its way back to the stream during low flow times as additional seepage and underflow and so on. And that could have tremendous ecological benefits during low flow times. And I know that's not in the scope of what you're looking at today, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands that although you might be making a sacrifice on high flows inevitably for this type of work, that could be more than compensated for by the low flow alterations. And of course, how do you pair those different kinds of apples is going to be a tricky situation, but nonetheless, it is a big facet.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Norman. And that was one of the reasons why we didn't look at change in the dry season and change in the spring recession because we don't have a model to do that. Like, I think ideally, if this type of work happens in a groundwater basin that has a groundwater surface water model, and you can more accurately model the potential benefits or risks to the dry season into the recession, that would be ideal.
Right, right.
Because then you can speak to, okay, there's risks here, but there may be benefits here.
Exactly. Thanks.
Kathy, sorry, my voice is dying.
No worries. Thank you for all the information, but I'm just curious, in your models, can the functional flow be actually set to be the permanent minimum flow that is required for salmon health? So that way, even if the percentiles, whatever, are different for the year, you always have that base flow for the salmon to be protected. Because I mean, the Yurok tribe just removed all the dams on the Klamath, and the fish are actually going up into Scott River. They've seen them, so and we don't want them to disappear again. So, can there be a baseline that is set permanently to maintain functional flows at the CFS that will protect the salmon?
Sorry. I'll try to answer this through my voice, but my voice is dying. Um, Very good point. I think along the lines of what Christian was asking, if there are site-specific studies done at a specific location where like, we want to protect it by this amount, and if you look on the natural flows database and that amount is different, whether it's maybe that amount might be lower, you can move that back up. And so I didn't talk about the steps within SEF, but I think all of that applies, where you start out with your natural flows as a starting point, and then where you have additional site-specific data that maybe more tailored towards that specific location, you can go ahead and refine it to ensure that those ecological functions are protected. And especially if you have that data and you've been monitoring and you have confidence in that. So I think that's a really good point.
Thank you.
Alyssa, maybe you can go through, if there aren't any other ones, you could read them because my voice.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No.
Let's see. If we already kind of talked about the various modeling, right? Whether the model can be correlated to the snowpack.
Oh, sorry. Kathy, what did you mean by can the model be correlated with snowpack?
Well, our rivers and everything are basically fed by snowpack throughout a lot of the year, right? They're supposed to be anyway. That's the main water storage. So if there is no snowpack, because our snowpack is decreasing throughout time, right? What are the flows going to be with reduced snowpack? That's what I mean.
And so can the functional flow models, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, can the functional flow models be correlated to how much snowpack we get?
I think you can do that correlation if you have the data on snowpack each year and you have a gauge, let's say, with your functional flow metrics, you definitely that would be a cool thing to look at is for every year, kind of what's that relationship. And then potentially you could use that in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
It looks like there's a question from Paul.
Yeah, Chris, hi. Since we're talking about lopping off the peaks of big flows, it struck me that a potentially useful metric for comparing effects on channel maintenance might be computing effective discharge and comparing. A little bit of work, but
Yeah, I think definitely you could do more site-specific analyses on that. One of the reasons why we have the 2, 5, and 10 was as a proxy to look at those flows that do geomorphic work. But yeah, definitely, I think if you want to hone in more on those peak values with more specific studies, that would be great.
yeah, that's a question brought up in the North Coast policy. How much can you chop off without affecting channel processes? And we sort of settled on like 5%. But yeah.
Yeah, so that's something that we can't say with the data that we have here is like when do you start seeing those functions being um, taken away or reduced? Um, but I guess that one of the thoughts with the functional flows approach is if unimpaired is your um, is what you want to protect, then you can see how far away. But I don't think we can necessarily get at what level of deviation are you going to start to see things happening
Yeah.
without more site-specific studies.
Yeah. Is a tough nut.
Yeah, yeah. But it is like important and interesting to look at.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Kimberly?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. I thought that was fascinating. I'm not a scientist. I didn't understand half of it, but I think it's getting,
Sorry about that.
no, it's getting at stuff that, I care a lot about in the stream flows and stuff. So, and I thought, you were looking for maybe other partners to do maybe additional, modeling or whatever. And I don't know, it seemed like the Napa River might be a good place. I think they have a pretty good groundwater basin group over there. So I don't know if they're on the call or not, but it seemed like it. And I don't know if you go to smaller streams or not, but Green Valley Creek goes dry quite a bit, and it's an important salmon stream. So it'd be interesting to see if there might be opportunities there. There's a lot of interest and work being done on Green Valley Creek over here now on the Russian River. And then I just kind of was wanted to say that, yeah, I mean, I'd be very interested in knowing how much of this actually does is allowed to escape groundwater and go back to creeks, and how much is going to be pumped out for other things. So I don't know if there's information about that already, or that's future work.
Yeah, we don't have that information as it is with the data that we have, but I think those are all really important questions, and maybe in watersheds like the Napa that have a lot of cool studies, like really good data, I think that would be a great place to test it out and look at it. Maybe we can touch base later. Any other, did I miss a question?
Um, I think I answered this in the chat, but Verna asked a question about whether you have looked at flows flushing out sediment at the delta, and I think she's referring to in the Klamath. I'm not sure, but and whether that was something you looked at.
Yeah, I think Alyssa, you answered it.
Okay.
We didn't look at that necessarily for that specific flushing at the Delta. We did look at just the 2, 5, and 10-year flood events. And the thought there was if we can preserve those, then it can help with a lot of other geomorphic functions that we want to preserve. But yeah, like Alyssa said, I think if you have that information or you have a more site-specific study or model to look at that, you can most definitely refine the peak flow magnitudes that you're using as your thresholds. And I think that would be a great pilot to look at too, because I don't think we've looked at that in any of our studies.
No, I don't think so. I think that covers what was in the chat. I think you touched on most of these.
Um, and then Bronwyn added that the idea behind CEF is that multiple different types of functional flows are required to protect salmon and other ecological functions over time, and it's just not a static minimum flow. Yeah, that's a really good point to hone in on, is that, that variability of flows and not just, one aspect, one base flow is what really provides the broad set of ecological functions. And that's what we're trying to protect with all this. Camiar says the San Joaquin watershed studies completed by DWR partners demonstrate the connection between diversions for floodmar and Firamar and dry season accretion from aquifers to rivers. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I want to take a deeper look at that because I know that the reports are out now. So that's really cool. And I think that actually would be a great presentation at a future EFOS work group meeting. I'd love to hear more about the studies, watershed studies. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, we can move on. I think the next thing on our agenda would be future agenda topics, any topics of interest, any presentations in particular that people would like to hear about. We try our best to um, get a wide range of speakers, and so if you have anyone or any group that are doing really cool work, let us know, and we can reach out to them. Any topics? I know we've had it before. We had one meeting that was like a topic area. So we had one all on stream temperature. We could have, a focal topic area and try to find presenters under that. Or we can just have any talks that people are interested in. Nothing? Oh, Kimberly said, I'm interested in the impacts of logging in salmon watersheds and effects on stream flow, and especially in summer and recharge. Cool. Yeah.
Good suggestion. I'll make a note of that. Thanks, Kimberly.
Any other topics of interest? So far, it seems like the San Joaquin watershed studies, and then maybe something focused on logging and recharge. Verna says stream temperature would be great, especially emphasizing the importance of cold base flows from groundwater. Yeah, that's a important linkage. Anything else? And I do want to say, I may have forgotten to mention that this pilot study that I just presented on is wrapping up in the next week or two. And so um, for anyone interested, I'm happy to share our tech report from that. And I'll post the presentation on our EFOS workgroup website as well. Okay, well, if there isn't anything else, again, just a reminder, our next meeting is going to be on November 17th. Typically, we have these on is this the second Tuesday of the month, every 3 months, 4 months, every quarter? Um, this one is different. The next one is different because we have a conflict with the California Bioassessment Work Group meeting, and so we're postponing it to the third Tuesday of November, so November 17th, same time. It's going to be on Zoom as well. So I'll send out a new quarterly meeting series registration link, and so you'll have to fill that out, and then you'll just get a whole new meeting invite that you can add to your calendar, and just go ahead and delete the old November one if it's still on your calendar from this past series. And if anyone else has any other questions, suggestions, they want to touch base on any of this, feel free to reach out to me or Alyssa or Brianna as well. We're happy to touch base offline. And yeah, thanks so much for joining, and welcome our new attendees to this meeting. And I hope that everyone has a nice rest of your day.
Thanks, Chris, for your presentation and for facilitating.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.